Good morning, everybody, on this beautiful Tuesday morning. Well, Margaret just kindly gave the one-line introduction of who each of you are, and I want to take just a moment at the beginning to give people just a tiny bit more information, because you're coming at this from three very different perspectives. Jim Wholey, down there, we mentioned you're an attorney focusing on the intersection of government, national security, and business, and you also have a legislative background in that you worked on the Hill for many years, chief of staff for Bob Dole when he was over there as well. So,
that was a while ago.
That was a little while ago. Have things changed much?
Sure looks it.
Okay. And then in the middle here we have Doug Myers. We mentioned you are Chief Information Officer at Pepco, 2 million customers, is
Correct.
That right? Give or take. So one of the biggest energy providers in the Mid-Atlantic region. I'm sure you're powering the lights for us today, not to mention the coffee makers, so thank you
Correct.
for
Critical
that.
infrastructure, yes.
And then to my left, Jean Young, you just received your PhD from MIT. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I know you're headed off to Carnegie Mellon as an assistant professor in the not-so-distant future, and co-founder of Cybersecurity Factory, as we just heard. So I'm going to ask you about that in just a minute. But I wanted to give you just a little bit more background, because this is by design. We've got three people up here coming at cybersecurity from very different perspectives: the legal, legislative perspective, the private sector, academia, and tech startups. And as you all know, depending on where you sit, both the risks and the possible solutions in the cybersecurity world can look very different. And what I'm hoping we can do in this session is tease that out a little bit, figure out the areas where your worlds played well together, areas where that's been less the case, and see if y'all might learn a thing or two from each other. So, Doug, I'm going to start with you to help get our arms around the scale of this threat. We'll kick off the morning by scaring the bejesus out of everybody here. What is the Doomsday Scenario? From Pepco's point of view.
So we're starting off light. Okay.
Yeah. They're coffeeed up. We're good to go.
Well, things to keep in mind with critical infrastructure providers, we like to say that, the utility industry, we don't provide light and power, we actually enable civilization, right? So we understand we have a public trust to do that, and so we take it very seriously. Stuxnet was a real game changer. So
Stuxnet, the
correct.
Computer worm that
Yes,
went into
2010,
Iran centrifuges.
It was now outside of the lab. There was proof that code could actually destroy physical equipment. So you see now within the industry, you don't see comments like one attributed to an anonymous CEO 12 years ago that, oh, hacking a control system, that can't happen. And that was based on an old paradigm, which was these are all proprietary systems, security through obscurity. Stuxnet really made it abundantly clear that yes, hackers could start to get at the things that enable what we rely on every day. So a lot of good work is going into protecting against that, but I also want to mention that the Doomsday Scenario is not necessarily what you're going to see on television. So I believe 24 did a whole season around every bit of critical infrastructure in the nation was going through a single firewall. So guess what? Bad things happened as a result of that. Okay, that is not what we deal with. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more things standing in the way of us and calamity, but it is still a very serious threat, something we focus on every day.
I mean, I guess the one time we've come anywhere close to this, not a cyber attack, but the Great Blackout back in 2003, where some of you who are living here will remember this, millions of people were without power all the way well up into Canada. That was, it turned out, a tree branch in Ohio that was brushing up against a power line. But your point is that a cyber attack could be infinitely worse, and we need to prepare for it.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind with that is what typically happens when you look at any sort of unintended consequence. There are multiple things that should have happened that didn't happen. And the industry now has, I believe it's the only critical infrastructure provider that does have mandatory cybersecurity standards to protect against just that very event. If you actually look at the history of the utility industry, you will find that every 40 years or so something really bad happened and then legislation was passed to try to address it. But we're certainly in a much better place now than we were 12 years ago.
And I mean, it goes with that saying that the problem isn't just that the lights in the coffee makers would power down, but the traffic lights don't work, traffic comes to a halt, hospitals don't work. motorcades don't get through, which puts senior officials at risk, and all of the cascading effects of all
Yeah,
of this.
so again, we're pretty low on Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an industry, and we get that we simply have to be there. And so reliability really is everybody's job, and there is definitely within the utility industry, folks get it. They get that security equals reliability, and the more effort that gets put into cybersecurity plays out in reliability.
Jim, I mean, from where you sit, we're obviously, you know, a cyber attack on the power grid in Washington would be a local incident, but to what extent is it also a national security incident?
Well, as you know, it's clearly, a power outage here has ramifications way beyond what it would in most cities. I mean, aside from the government shutting down, which, depending on your point of view, may or may not be a catastrophe, but critical national security functions. I mean, a lot of our national security technology is air-gapped. Okay, they have all elaborate security precautions in place. But we've seen, if we've learned anything in the last 2 years, it's that is not. Stuxnet taught us that air-gapped systems are vulnerable. You know, there are ways to penetrate. If that happens here, there are systems that we rely upon for much more than turning the lights on or getting the elevators up and down or managing traffic, or even hospital emergencies going on. There are communications infrastructure. There are critical sensors around the world that an outage here would dramatically affect how the utilization. Now, there's redundancy built into all of this stuff, but you know, Doug's comment about when things went catastrophically wrong, it's because a number of things that should have happened didn't. It reminds me, I teach every third semester at the Naval Academy. I don't teach anything technical because I'm not competent to do that. I actually teach history. But a colleague of mine there says he finds all the early Tom Clancy novels comic. And I said, why? I love those books. Those are great. And he said, because all the stuff always works. Mm-hmm. Yes. And anyone who's spent a day on active duty, either in the military or doing anything else, knows that all the toys you have, you can count on them not all working, particularly when you need them most.
I guess this speaks to, you know, whose problem it is to fit the bill. You know, you talked a little bit about public utilities being the only ones that have a inscribed set of rules governing what their responsibilities are. You know, you're advising clients all the time on regulatory issues, trade. Is it clear to the companies you advise what the rules are that they need to follow when it comes to cybersecurity? Is it a clear set of regulation, or is this more the Wild West at this point where the terrain is changing constantly?
I think awareness is growing rapidly. I don't think it's the Wild West, but the rules are anything but clear. Most of the companies that I advise are not tech companies. Tech companies know that they're tech companies, and their network and their assets are a critical part of what they do. Companies that I advise that are not technical companies, I try to explain to them, you don't think you're a tech company. Yes, you are. Because everyone is dependent upon the internet. Everyone is dependent upon data. Many of my clients outsource their data. You know, if you're a retailer, you accept credit cards. Chances are you're not processing those payments. You have a third-party payments processing provider. They're the technical folks. What's your liability when something goes wrong? We've seen that happen numerous times now with retailers who've had a cyber breach. What are the consequences of that? Well, the problem is that the rules aren't clear. My client, right now, one of my pet peeves is, as someone who's worked in Republican administrations and worked as a Republican staffer on the Hill, I'm not fond of federal solutions to things. But this is one area where at least federal standards, it cries out, in my view, for federal standards. Everybody now is aware of the dangers of a cyber breach. In fact, the latest case in the Eastern Federal Court in the Eastern District of Missouri, Schnuck versus for first payment in city cards, the court expressly held that they had a provision between the service provider and the retailer, who was the customer in this case, that they would share liability up to a certain amount.
Right.
And it's a general liability kind of insurance policy. There were a list of exclusions. The court held that the service provider was not entitled to break that cap on liability because the court held, and it's the first time I've seen it, that data compromise was such a foreseeable and inevitable risk that if you didn't expressly exclude it, it was deemed to be included. In other words, you could have and should have listed it if you didn't mean to include it. It's that obvious. It's like fire insurance now.
It's the not if, but when.
Mm-hmm. It's the not if, but when.
It makes you wonder.
And the problem is, just to finish up, and I'm sorry,
Please.
is that we don't have a federal standard. We were chatting about this before we came on here. There is unless you're a healthcare provider or a service provider to a healthcare provider under HIPAA, or you're a financial institution with privacy obligations under Gramm-Leach-Bliley. This is legislative shorthand, eyes glaze over, I'll explain later. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, or yourself a government agency, there really isn't a federal standard. What you have is a patchwork of almost 50 different sets of state laws. It's governed by state law and by contract. So the allocation of prospective liability is privately negotiated, or if you're a multi-state employer or a multi-state retailer, you have to have separate insurance policies for each different kind of risk. That's impossible. It's really, really difficult. Insurance companies, it's essential. I work a lot with startup and mid-sized companies. Insurance is essential. Insurance companies are having a very difficult time writing adequate policies for this. First of all, for two reasons. Number one, there's no actuarial data. Okay. So they have to go in and examine every potential coverage risk for what's their network security, what measures do they take, what is their recovery plan, what is the restriction on employee access to the data, the whole panoply of things that you worry about every day, Doug, as part of your business. The insurance companies have to go in and do that and kind of diligence for each company and in each state in which they operate. Well, like any hand-tailored product, that's very expensive, prohibitively so. And as all of us had experience with insurance companies, they'll write a policy and you can pay for it, but if it's a claim, it's probably not covered. But until we have a federal standard, it's going to be impossible for medium-sized companies to be able to actually sell the risk that they need in order to do business.
All right, I hope the journalists in the room are taking note. We have a Republican up here begging for federal regulation and rules. It's a first. We're breaking news this morning.
Federal standards.
Federal standards, not regulation. Gene, let me draw you in, because you're coming at this from a technology point of view and looking at technology solutions as a computer scientist. We mentioned you've founded this program called Cybersecurity Factory, which, as I understand it, it's a little bit like a cybersecurity boot camp, summer camp. Explain, what was the thinking?
The thinking was, so as an academic, I spent a lot of time thinking about what's going to happen when software comes to run our lives. And I got into cybersecurity because I thought about, well, it seems like that's the thing people care about. When software comes to run our lives, what's going to happen when the software is not correct and we have all these vulnerabilities? And I became familiar with all of these really nice technologies that take us to a world where we're building our software using better tools, and we have better assurance that all the software is doing what we think it's doing. And of course, something always goes wrong, but we have more assurance than we do now. And I started talking to industry people, and it seemed like the state of the art in industry was firewalls. So the analogy that I make is that we've invented all these things like locks and lock boxes and really fine-grained controls for our data, and we're still using moats and drawbridges. And so a friend and I thought about, well, why is this? And one thing that we came up with was that it's really hard for these research ideas to make their way into industry. It's hard for them to do it directly in big companies because there's all this stuff that big companies have to deal with. Managers have to fight the status quo. Programmers have to deal with legacy code. They have to make the new techniques work with all the old code. But startups don't deal with these kinds of problems. And we thought about it more. And what startups do deal with is they have to have flashy demos. They have to get investors to believe in the idea. And if we think about the hot Silicon Valley startup, a really good example is Tinder for dogs. There's a flashy demo, there's an easy concept, everyone can understand it. Dog lovers can meet other dog lovers by swiping left, swiping right. The new security startup that's going to fix things probably isn't going to look like that. It's going to have a technical concept. The customers are going to need to have either expertise or a lot of trust in the company to buy this solution. And also the people building these security solutions, they're technical people. They're not the kinds of people who are probably going to be good at building a product. And so because of this, my friend Frank Wang, who's also a MIT PhD student, we started Cybersecurity Factory, which is an 8-week accelerator. So it's like Y Combinator, which is another accelerator that gives companies, startup companies, funding, office space, and a network for getting started.
And the idea is basically there are all these great ideas in academia
Yes.
that are staying in academia, and people don't know or how to monetize that, how to get it out to the companies that could really benefit from it.
Yeah, and there's a bridge, I think, between those last two comments. One is you can attempt to solve this problem with legislation, not standards, but legislation. But typically the marketplace moves a lot faster and adapts a lot quicker than legislation does. So, and when you take, for example, supply chain integrity, that's an issue a lot of folks who are responsible for critical infrastructure care about. That's the integrity of the devices we're using to run our networks. That is not something that legislation is really going to potentially solve. You've got, first off, it's a global supply chain. It's very difficult to get transparency into these manufacturing practices because those are trade secrets. Those are not things that these companies want to give up willingly. So we had a healthy debate about that within the Edison Electric Institute CIO and Executive Advisory Council that I'm on. That's EEI, CIO, EAC. So that's 9 letters.
Wow, okay.
MOUSE. So anyway, but the point is we had a healthy debate about that, and we concluded that actually the better way to try to get at this issue is through the marketplace. And that's to make sure vendors understand that security is functionality. It's not a trade-off, security or functionality. Security is functionality. And if these vendors understand, they have that Volvo moment where they realize that I'm not putting seatbelts in my car because the government's telling me to. I'm putting safety into my product because that's a way I can have sustainable competitive advantage. So we're really getting that message out to the vendors so they understand that this is how they're going to be judged. And they can make more money if they actually deliver a better and more secure product. And it also gets to the point you've been making, which is that the degree to which we can harness the entrepreneurial spirit, but also marry that with federal standards, now all of a sudden these folks know what they need to aim at. So we've talked also about it'd be great if there was some sort of good housekeeping seal of approval that could be put onto some of these products, so that similar to underwriters' laboratories, which in turn then allows the entrepreneurs to be that much more focused in terms of what they're trying to deliver.
Gene, just to circle this back to a practical example and the work that you're involved in, as I understand it, the Home Depot hack, which many of us will have heard about, couldn't be traced back to, could have been thwarted if that company had been storing its data in a better encrypted cloud environment.
Right.
And that's something of the candidates that you were working with this summer, that was one of the projects that they're working on, is how you encrypt stuff in the cloud, but still allow the company and clients that need to use that data to use it.
Right, exactly. So in research, there have been all kinds of solutions for how can we encrypt data in the cloud, how can we still compute over data that's encrypted without decrypting it, because every time you decrypt data, it's vulnerable to hacks. And the teams we had for Cybersecurity Factory this summer, both of them worked on encrypting not just the data in the cloud, but also patterns of access of the data. Because if you can't access the data, you might still be able to look at how the computations over the data are operating and infer something from that.
Is one of the challenges, and this speaks to all three of your worlds, that there are just so many more ways in. I mean, we're all familiar with the Internet of Things, that soon our coffee makers will be texting us, telling us to fill up the water tank, and it's everything. It's, our washing machines and our home security systems, and you can now buy toilets that are connected to Bluetooth. You don't even want to know what they're texting. And some of this is, it's incredibly cool. One example that I was recently reading about is the egg carton in your fridge will alert the fridge when it is empty. Your fridge will add eggs to the shopping list on the shopping app and order it for you. As Safeway arrives to deliver it, your smart front door lock knows the window that he's coming because your phone has alerted him and opens the door so he can put it in your fridge, and you never even know you were out of eggs. It's cool. However, each of those interactions opens a vulnerability that can be exploited. And let me flip that one back to you again. Is this something that can be solved by smart programming?
I don't think it can completely ever be solved, but smarter programming can go a long way. Because if we think about it, all of the programming tools that we use now have been around since the 1970s. Every construct in a mainstream language we've had since the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we didn't have these security and privacy concerns. And so to build security into systems right now, programmers have to go and by hand write these checks all over their program. And so something I've been working on is figuring out how we can push those into the system. And other people also work on how do we push encryption into the system so the programmer doesn't have to worry about it. How do we make programming tools and software platforms and all these kinds of techniques so that the programmer doesn't have to think about what are the security and privacy concerns every time they write a new line of code. And that can take us a long way to making these systems have fewer vulnerabilities.
What about from either of your approaches? I mean, are corporate security teams keeping up with the rapid speed of technology?
It's funny, when you do the autopsy or you read the autopsies on these breaches, it's amazing how many times it was something really basic got overlooked. And I'll try to illustrate that with a quick story. Anybody in this room who wants to hack a website, we can do it this afternoon. You're going to have to buy 2 tools. You're going to have to buy a tool, and these tools I think are going to cost you in total under $100. The first tool is going to scan the internet and find unpatched public-facing servers. And the second tool will be one that can run some sort of attack on that. Now, I didn't say that you could go hack a particular company this afternoon. That's going to take you a lot longer. If you're going to choose to really focus on a particular target, it's going to take you a lot longer, a lot more money, and a lot more time. But the point is, if these basics are managed, then it's amazing how much of the threat surface gets addressed. And getting back to those mandatory cybersecurity standards I mentioned, that's what they're looking at. It's one of the things they're looking at is making sure that we're all in the electric industry getting the basics right. And to your point around standards, that's something that potentially, I think, has some applicability beyond the electric industry into some of the other critical infrastructure providers as well. But if you get the basics right, and they call it network hygiene, you get that right, a lot of the threat surface gets addressed.
And Doug spoke earlier about some kind of standards like an underwriter's laboratory, and that the market is beginning to address some of these issues. Excuse me. Not to sound like a broken record, but getting back to my point about insurance, underwriters' laboratories, those were standards imposed by insurers. The problem in this arena is that you would look to the insurers as they become more sophisticated to impose minimum network assurance practices and equipment. And that's all fine, but at the end of the day, with 40 plus different state laws and different scopes of liability, it's very difficult for the insurance companies to do that because they're writing all of these bespoke policies. And until some other entity has to impose some kind of national standards, and it's tough for the insurers to do that in this context, unlike regulating minimum standards for manufacturing electrical equipment or other underwriter laboratories approved. Some good housekeeping seal of approval. I'm not saying it has to be federal, but there has to be a benchmark that will apply across all the states. Otherwise, it's an impossible task.
And where do you think that should come from? I mean, when you say some entity should impose this, is the part of the problem is that it's not quite clear who owns this at the federal level?
That's very much a part of the problem. Private sector is doing some of this. For example, in the payments processing industry, there's a self-regulatory agency, the Payment Card Institute, and they have DSS, their security standards. And if you are PCI/DSS, see, I can do this too, PCI DSS compliant, that goes a long way towards reducing the card processing provider's liability. It also goes a long way towards reducing the customer's liability. It's now at a point where if you contract with a payments processor that isn't PCI DSS compliant, that's almost per se negligence, and a court in most states will find that you screwed up and you owe your customers. That's a good way for the market to begin to do self-regulation, which is what we would all prefer. I'm just suggesting that insurance companies, as they get more actuarial data, as they do more of this, will be able to come up with certain minimum standards they'll look for, but it's not going to solve the problem of the scope of liability in various different states.
I want to open it up to your questions in just one moment, but let me throw one more question in the hopper before we do that, which is just the question of cost. It is really expensive insuring against, planning for, protecting against cyber threats. You know, in any industry, resources are finite. What are the calculations being made in terms of figuring out, you know, I was saying to you, Doug, right before we came out, you know, any dollar you spend protecting against the cyber threat is a dollar that you can't spend laying new power lines or getting more trucks or training new staff. How are you thinking about that calculation? Because the risk is so new and nebulous in some ways. You just don't know how it's going to play out.
I'll answer that for today, and then the answer for 10 years might be different.
Okay.
Everything gets put through the filter of reliability. So when you're a project that is competing for dollars within a utility, you're trying to determine where will it generate the most benefit for the customers. So it's not a stretch really to think about how cybersecurity can fit into that. I can tell you this, and most utility CIOs would say the same thing. When we need money to get things done in the cyberspace, we get the money to do the work. Now, it's not hard, though, to imagine a world 10 or 20 years from now where suddenly add 1 or 2 zeros to the numbers we're talking about, and it's a lot harder then to get those kind of dollars. Now,
and you're adding zeros just because the threat is growing.
Yeah, as the threat grows, obviously the cost grows. Now, this is going to sound counterintuitive. As the cost grows, it's also growing for the attackers. And that will crowd folks out of the marketplace. So when it's really cheap to launch an attack at a company, there's a lot more people that can go try to do it. As the cost of this goes up and up and up, you get fewer players in there, and you have somewhat of a more stable environment to try to manage it. It's still risky. But so there is absolutely an arms race that's going to go on. Folks like you are going to help in that regard because you're going to help us stay ahead of the bad guys because you'll come up with a great entrepreneurial solution. Won't make the bad guys go away. They'll in turn adapt back. So it's an interesting dilemma, and why it really is a dilemma in the regulated world is that regulated companies like utilities can't just choose to raise the price of their service. You know, there's a whole construct you have to go through 50 states and a district to try to make certain that you can get recovery for prudent expenses.
This has been something that's been raised, though, in terms
absolutely.
of raising customer rates, because somebody's got to foot the bill for this.
Absolutely, and you also worry about the scenario where it really is one grid, that 50 states in one district are all part of, or at least in the continental U.S., 48 states in one district. And if there is one commission out there that really takes a diametrically different view on cybersecurity than another, they can potentially put folks at risk beyond their jurisdiction, which is why you have to get back, I think, to a conversation around federal standards.
And you made the point that I was going to make, which is in the world of my clients, all costs ultimately get passed to the customer. So the constraints on the resources that you put into security are dictated by which strategy you adopt. You either take risks and cut corners to stay competitive price-wise, or you invest a lot in these resources, you brand yourself as more secure, and you try to sell yourself at a premium on that basis. But it's a hard choice to make.
Questions? We have a microphone out here. I'll take one down here. If you wait 1 second, we've got a mic making its way to you. And if you can try to keep your questions brief, tell us your name, your affiliation, if you want to share one.
This question is for Doug. My name is Stuart Sloan. This question is really a first cousin to cyber attacks, and that is relating to EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and specifically referring to your company. I read an article not long ago that Dominion Power, which supplies power to the White House and to the Pentagon, has protected its infrastructure by burying it underground to protect against EMP. What is your company doing with respect to that?
Yeah, if I were to answer that question, I don't think I'd be working at the company anymore. So obviously, there's certain things that you recognize these threats, you take steps to address the threats. Now, EMP is a pretty significant issue. I was on a panel where General Hayden, former head of NSA and I believe CIA both, and he got the EMP question shortly before me, and the answer he gave was that the government recognized it was a really important topic. They'd meet every 3 months or so to discuss it. And the end of the meeting, they discover they need to meet again in 3 more months to discuss it. Now, I suspect there's a lot more going on than that. But the fact is, we have in our emergency planning an all hazards approach. We're aware of everything from hurricanes to cyber threats, We have an incident command structure we have in place to try to address all those threats. So any risk to reliable service is something that we put through our filter, and we take the appropriate steps to mitigate those risks.
And just to quickly follow, to what extent are you talking to Dominion Power and others? And
Oh,
learning
actually,
from
that's
their
a great
best practice?
thing about the utility industry. Unlike a lot of, probably like most industries out there, there is a lot of collaboration with this industry. So just a quick story around that. Mutual assistance. So last week, with Hurricane Joaquin potentially looking to make landfall, what the utility industry does is they start to institute their 72-hour checklists, and they have what are these called mutual assistance calls, which is simply how we help our neighbors out. So if the storm is projected to make landfall in DC, we can talk to utility in Georgia and get crews to come up and help us out. And it is a self-organized structure where utilities figure out a way that they can help each other at times like this. So we help each other, we share learnings with each other, we recognize that we're all in this together, try to enable and support this grid that we're all relying on.
There was a hand up over here. Yes, sir. Bring the mic to you. Good morning.
Hi, I'm Larry Altenberg. I'm with SCNA Incorporated. I was part of the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection almost 20 years ago. And Jim, I very much appreciate your comments about not wanting regulation. But frankly, here we are almost 20 years later. Billions and billions of dollars in losses. Millions of private citizens' data has been lost. Why can't we do things differently now? Why the push against regulation? Isn't it time for us to really consider regulation while we're also developing standards?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that what I've been advocating here is there's a fine line between regulation and standards, and we'll probably have to sort that out. But I'm advocating standards. Regulation, I'm not sure federal regulation, while it's invariably well-intended, that it always works out as hoped. But that said, let me turn this around and ask you a question. And I'd like to hear from anyone else here who wants to talk about this. Right now, there's the cyber information sharing legislation that's been out there. What has impeded it is privacy concerns, organized privacy concerns, because that's how you get input into the legislative process. You're talking about all of the bad things that have happened over the last 2 decades. Absent some kind of federal, at least, let's agree on a word, not regulations, we'll call it some kind of oversight, some kind of platform. And here's the opportunity to take steps in that direction. But it's the opposition to it, I call it sort of the Snowden syndrome. There are people who are more concerned with individual privacy of their data from the government than they are with keeping it private or more secure from those who would obtain that data for malicious purposes, either to harm them, their enterprise, or society as a whole. I think there are legitimately different points of view on that, but that tension between these privacy concerns and the obvious need to bolster security and to share information, to strengthen, to address the problems that you've cited, sadly, have been going on for so long, is I'd be interested in how people in this room feel about weighing that balance. We have a bill out there that is far from perfect. I worked 14 years in the Senate, and I never saw a perfect piece of legislation. But at least it's steps towards doing what you are suggesting is badly needed. And the concerns, and this is something I think people will probably be discussing all day long today, but the tension, I don't know how real that tension is. It's real enough to have held up the bill. I'd be interested in what people here thought.
Would you like to respond to that?
No.
There are multiple points of tension that we're drawing out here. Obviously, undergirding all of this is the tension between privacy and security. We spoke as well. This speaks to the issues that you're dealing with on a programming level. That the more encrypted, the more you are able to protect a piece of data, the less available it is for the company, the client, whoever it is who's trying to use it, and how you balance that informs all of this. Another question from over here. I saw a hand up over here. Yes, sir. We'll bring the mic right over to you. There we go, right there.
Hi, thanks for taking questions. Blake Subcheck with Energy Wire. I was just curious if you could speak to the idea of pay to play for good cybersecurity, especially Doug, like how, you know, as a utility with a lot of funds to be able to apply to cybersecurity, how does that compare to, say, a municipal utility who's still connected to the grid? You know, it's often said that good cyber hygiene kind of, you know, lifts all boats here, but what if the smaller players can't afford to pay for good cybersecurity protection? Same would go for like a new app. If it's out of reach for most people, how do you address that? Thanks.
Pay to play.
Well, I think a lot of the, as I mentioned, a lot of the steps the first steps to be taken to most greatly reduce the risk don't actually really cost that much money. I mean, the cost of network hygiene, it'll pay for itself, first of all. And it's simply about making sure you've got good processes and good procedures in place. The patches, for example, don't cost you any money. They're available. It's about downloading them from the operating system provider and making sure that you have a diligent process for making sure they get applied. So there's a lot to be said for steps that can be taken that don't really cost a whole lot of money. I think the question you raise is a good one, but I don't think it's one at the moment that really folks are grappling with, because the tools to be invested in are not really out of reach. I mean, you're not talking about millions and millions of dollars here. As I mentioned, in 10 or 20 years, there could be a scenario where the cost of cyber protecting critical infrastructure could be much different, and I think at that point it's a much different conversation, and frankly it's not even municipals versus investor-owned utilities at that point. You then can have the question about what if one state feels appropriate for their customers to bear that cost and another state does not. I think at this point I would encourage folks to focus on get those basics right, get the network hygiene right. That stuff really doesn't cost you all that much money.
All right, Doug Myers, we're going to have to leave it there. Jim Wholey, Gene Young, thank you all for a great kickoff conversation. We are about to exit this way.